He, a tycoon with amnesia, doesn't recognize the secretary who loves him. She laughs with a colleague. He sees her, feels jealous. Matthew realizes that even without his memory, his heart recognizes her. Before we dive into the story, leave a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Jessica Ramsey adjusted her glasses for the third time in 5 minutes, watching the frantic activity on the 22nd floor of Sterling Tech. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of tension that always hung in the air when board meetings approached. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with the precision of someone who had memorized every function, every shortcut, every secret of that tech empire that had grown under her watch for the past 6 years. At 28, Jessica carried the weight of a responsibility that went far beyond her official title. Executive assistant. The title didn't do justice to the reality of being the company's living memory, the bridge between the CEO and the outside world, the guardian of corporate secrets that could move millions in the market. Her modest apartment in Brooklyn contrasted sharply with the luxury she managed daily, but Jessica never cared about that disparity. Her wealth lay elsewhere, in the silent admiration she harbored for her boss, a feeling she kept like a dangerous treasure deep in her heart. Her cell phone vibrated with a message from her mom. "Jessica, when are you bringing a boyfriend home to meet the family?" The question echoed weakly, and the answer was always the same evasive one. How could she explain that her heart belonged to a man who didn't even know of her existence beyond the morning reports and scheduled meetings? How could she confess that every good morning Jessica uttered by that deep voice made her stomach flutter, that every professional smile from him was like a ray of sunshine on her gray day? The elevator emitted its characteristic metallic whir, announcing someone's arrival. Jessica straightened her shoulders instinctively. A Pavlovian reaction developed over the years. But when the doors opened, it wasn't Matthew Sterling who emerged, but Mrs. Sterling, his mother, accompanied by a man in an impeccable suit, whom Jessica didn't recognize. "Where's my son?" Mrs. Sterling's voice cut through the air like a blade, laden with an authority that made employees automatically defer. "I need to speak with Matthew immediately." Jessica stood up, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied encounters with the Sterling family matriarch. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling. Mr. Sterling is in a meeting with the development board. Can I take a message or schedule?" "You don't understand," Mrs. Sterling interrupted, her dark eyes fixed on Jessica with a disturbing intensity. "Matthew was in an accident last night. He's at New York Presbyterian Hospital." Jessica's world crumbled in a fraction of a second. The air escaped her lungs as if someone had punched her diaphragm. Her hands trembled, and she needed to lean on the desk to keep from staggering. An accident? How? Is he all right? Can I see him?" The man in the suit stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Robert Miller, the neurologist in charge of the case. Mr. Sterling suffered a traumatic brain injury in a car accident. Physically, he's recovering well, but..." The doctor's pause felt like an eternity. "He's developed partial amnesia. He doesn't remember the last 2 years." Jessica felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. 2 years. Precisely the period when she had managed to get closer to Matthew, when he had begun to trust her with more personal matters, when she had nurtured the illusion that perhaps, just perhaps, he would begin to see her as something more than an efficient employee. "He doesn't remember much about the company, about the people," the doctor continued, his voice seeming to come from far away. "A gradual reintegration process will be necessary. That's why we're here. Mrs. Sterling believes it would be best if certain influences were minimized during the recovery period." Mrs. Sterling approached Jessica's desk, her heels echoing on the marble floor like a funeral march. "Jessica, dear, you understand that my son needs stability now. Familiar people, familiar faces. Perhaps it would be best if you took a vacation. Let someone closer to the family take care of his affairs for now." The coldness of the suggestion hit Jessica like a slap. She was being sidelined. At the moment when Matthew most needed people who knew his routine, his appointments, his professional life, she was being deliberately excluded. And the worst part was that in his current condition, Matthew wouldn't even question her absence. Jessica began, but her voice failed. How could she fight against a mother protecting her son? How could she explain that she knew Matthew better than any family member? That she knew his favorite coffee brand, his schedules, his quirks, his fears by heart? How could she say that her love for him transcended any professional matter? The reception phone rang, a strident sound that broke the tense silence. Jessica answered automatically, her voice mechanical. Sterling Tech, good afternoon. Jessica. The voice on the other end of the line made her heart stop. It was Matthew. Sorry to bother you, but they said you're my secretary. I'm here at the hospital and, well, it seems I don't remember much. Could you come here? I need to better understand how my company works, my routine. There are some papers here that don't make sense to me. Jessica looked at Mrs. Sterling, who had visibly paled. The doctor frowned, clearly displeased. It was Matthew taking the reins of his own recovery, unaware that he was defying the carefully laid plans of his family. Of course, Mr. Sterling, Jessica replied, her voice gaining firmness. I'll be there in 20 minutes. New York Presbyterian Hospital had never seemed so intimidating to Jessica. Her footsteps echoed through the pristine hallway as she carried a folder with documents that Matthew had requested. Contracts, financial reports, project timelines that he himself had approved weeks before and now needed to learn again. Each page was like a piece of a puzzle whose final image she knew by heart, but that for him would be completely new. Mrs. Sterling had followed her to the hospital, obviously displeased by her son's initiative. Throughout the elevator ride to the 14th floor, she had bombarded Jessica with warnings about not confusing Matthew with unnecessary information and about the importance of keeping things simple during his recovery. Remember, Mrs. Sterling murmured as they approached the room, he doesn't remember you. To him, you're a complete stranger. Don't try to create familiarity where none exists. Each word was a stab in Jessica's chest, but she nodded silently. She took a deep breath and lightly knocked on the slightly ajar door. Come in, came the familiar voice, although a little hoarser than usual. Jessica pushed the door open, and her heart almost stopped. Matthew was sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing light blue hospital pajamas that contrasted with his tanned skin. There was a discreet bandage on his right temple, but otherwise, he looked physically the same man she had fallen in love with. The same slightly disheveled brown hair, the same penetrating green eyes, the same confident posture, even in an environment of vulnerability. But when their eyes met, Jessica felt the devastating difference. There was no recognition, no automatic smile of someone seeing a familiar person. There was only polite curiosity and a clinical analysis, as if he were trying to catalogue her in his reorganized mind. You must be Jessica, he said, and the fact that he pronounced her name without any hint of intimacy was like receiving a punch to the gut. Thank you for coming. You're welcome, Mr. Sterling. The formality came naturally, an automatic protection against the pain that threatened to overflow. Matthew tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made Jessica feel exposed. Please call me Matthew. Mr. Sterling makes me feel like he's my dad. He gestured for her to come closer. How long have you been working for me? 6 years, Jessica replied, placing the folder on the bedside table. She could feel Mrs. Sterling shifting uncomfortably behind her. 6 years, Matthew repeated, as if testing the weight of that period. And what was I like as a boss? Fair? Difficult? You can be honest. The question caught Jessica off guard. How to summarize 6 years of admiration, respect, and unrequited love in an answer that didn't reveal her feelings. You've always been very professional, dedicated to your work, demanding but fair. You genuinely care about the company and the people who work in it. Something changed in Matthew's eyes as she spoke. A spark of interest that went beyond professional courtesy. You speak as if you know me well. Jessica began, but was interrupted by Mrs. Sterling, who stepped forward. Jessica is just an employee, dear. You maintained a strictly professional relationship. Perhaps it's better to focus on issues closer to the family for now. Matthew frowned, and for the first time since the accident, Jessica saw a glimmer of the determined man she knew. Mom, with all due respect, who better to explain to me how my company works than the person who has apparently been working directly with me for 6 years? The tension in the room was palpable. Mrs. Sterling pursed her lips but didn't respond. Matthew turned his attention to Jessica, and she felt a wave of heat rise up her neck. "Show me these documents," he asked, and as Jessica reached over to open the folder, he caught a trace of her perfume, the same one she had been wearing for years, discreet and floral. Something stirred inside Matthew's chest, a strange sensation he couldn't identify. That perfume. It's familiar. Jessica froze. I've been wearing the same one for a long time. Interesting, Matthew murmured, but didn't elaborate. Instead, he began to flip through the documents she had brought, asking specific questions about projects, clients, employees. And Jessica answered each one with a precision that surprised him. She knew not only the numbers and facts, but the contexts, the motivations behind each decision, the small details that only someone very close could know. She knew that he always reviewed important contracts on Friday mornings, that he preferred in-person meetings for delicate negotiations, that he had a particular aversion to overly colorful presentations. "How do you know I hate turquoise in charts?" Matthew asked, looking up from a report. Jessica felt the blood drain from her face. It was too intimate a detail, the result of years observing his subtle reactions. You always commented during department meetings." But Matthew continued to observe her with that disturbing intensity, as if trying to solve a riddle. There was something about Jessica that awakened familiar sensations in his fragmented brain, echoes of memories he couldn't fully access. Mrs. Sterling approached again. "Matthew, you're getting tired. Maybe it's better if Jessica comes back tomorrow." "Actually," Matthew said, without taking his eyes off Jessica, "I think I need you to accompany me for the next few days. I have meetings at the company on Monday, and apparently you're the only person who really understands how things work." "That's not necessary," Mrs. Sterling quickly interjected. "We can arrange for someone else, someone from the family to help." "Mom!" Matthew interrupted her, his voice taking on a tone of authority that Jessica knew well. "Jessica is my executive assistant. It makes sense that she helps me with professional reintegration." He turned to Jessica again. "If you don't mind, of course." Jessica felt her heart race. She would spend the next few days beside the man she loved, helping him rebuild his professional life, but knowing that to him she was nothing more than a useful stranger. "Of course, I'd be honored to help." "Great," Matthew smiled, and for a moment, Jessica saw a glimpse of the man she knew. "One last thing. You mentioned you've been working for me for 6 years. That means you were there when I started dating." He stopped, seeming to search for information in his fragmented memory. "Veronica," Mrs. Sterling provided quickly. "Veronica Hamilton. You got engaged 3 years ago." Jessica felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Veronica, the beautiful, educated socialite with the perfect social pedigree for the Sterling family. The woman who had been absent from Matthew's life in the months leading up to the accident, but who now, Jessica was sure, would return like a predator, smelling opportunity. "Oh yes," Matthew said slowly. "She came to see me yesterday, but I don't remember much about our relationship." This must be confusing for her, too. The phone in the room rang, interrupting the moment. Mrs. Sterling answered and her expression lit up. "It's Veronica, dear. She's coming up to see you." Jessica began to gather the documents automatically, preparing to leave, but Matthew lightly held her arm. The touch sent an electric current through her skin. "Don't go yet," he said, and there was something almost urgent in his voice. "I want you to meet Veronica. Maybe it will help me better understand things." Jessica nodded, knowing she was about to face the woman who represented everything she could never be in Matthew Sterling's life. The door to the room opened as if it were a triumphal entry. Veronica Hamilton emerged in a cloud of expensive perfume and calculated elegance, her Louboutin heels echoing on the hospital floor like a declaration of territory. She was impeccable, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, subtle but precise makeup, a Chanel dress that cost more than Jessica earned in 3 months. "My darling," Veronica murmured, heading straight for Matthew as if Jessica were just part of the furniture. She leaned down to kiss him on the forehead, a theatrically delicate gesture. "How are you feeling today?" Jessica watched Matthew accept the kiss with the same distant politeness he had shown her, but noticed how he didn't reciprocate the affection. His eyes remained alert, analytical, as if he were studying a stranger. "Better, thank you," Matthew replied politely. "Veronica, this is Jessica, my executive assistant. She's helping me better understand how the company works." Veronica finally deigned to look at Jessica, and the smile she offered was laden with condescension. "Ah, yes, the secretary. Such admirable dedication." Her words dripped with false sweetness. "But I'm sure my fiancé needs to rest now. Work matters can wait, can't they?" "Actually," Matthew interjected, "Jessica was explaining some important projects to me. It's fascinating how she knows every detail." Something flickered across Veronica's face, a flash of irritation quickly masked. "Of course, darling. But do you remember our tradition? Every Tuesday we used to go to Percy. I thought we could try that. Maybe it'll help with your memories." Matthew seemed genuinely confused. "I don't remember that tradition." Jessica felt a pang of guilty satisfaction. She knew Matthew loathed Percy. He found the atmosphere too pretentious. On the rare occasions when she had called to make reservations there at Veronica's request, he always muttered sarcastic comments about overpriced food that doesn't fill you up. "Perhaps," Jessica heard herself saying before she could stop herself, "Mr. Sterling prefers something more quiet. He always said that overly formal environments make him uncomfortable when he's stressed." 3 pairs of eyes turned to her, Mrs. Sterling with disapproval, Veronica with angry surprise, and Matthew with genuine interest. "Is that true?" Matthew asked. "Did I say that?" Jessica felt the blood rush to her face. She had revealed an intimacy that transcended the formal professional relationship. On some occasions, yes." "Interesting," Matthew murmured, and Jessica noticed how he watched her reaction with that disturbing intensity that made her stomach flutter. "And where do I prefer to go when I'm stressed?" Jessica was about to answer when Mrs. Sterling approached. "Matthew, you must be tired. Maybe it's better if we all come back tomorrow." But Matthew raised his hand, a gesture Jessica recognized. He did this in meetings when he wanted someone to finish speaking before being interrupted. "I would like to hear Jessica's answer." You like places by the sea," Jessica said hesitantly. "You once said that the sound of the waves helps you think, and you prefer small restaurants where you can talk without worrying about who's listening." Matthew was silent for a long moment, and Jessica could practically see the gears in his mind working. "You remember very specific conversations for someone who maintained only a professional relationship with me." Jessica's heart pounded. She had given herself away, revealed that she paid attention to details too intimate for a simple secretary. I've always been very observant with my superiors. It's part of the job to know their preferences. Are all secretaries so dedicated?" Matthew asked, and there was something in the way he pronounced the word dedicated that made Jessica feel a warmth rising up her neck. "Enough with these questions," Veronica interrupted sharply. "Matthew, you're tiring yourself unnecessarily. These people can resolve these issues between themselves." But Matthew didn't take his eyes off Jessica. "Actually, I need Jessica to accompany me when I leave the hospital tomorrow. I have an important meeting on Monday, and apparently she's the only one who really knows the details." "This is completely unnecessary," Mrs. Sterling interjected. "We can cancel your meetings until you recover completely." "No." Matthew's voice took on a firmness that Jessica knew well. It was the tone he used when his decision was final. "I've lost too much time already. Jessica, can you pick me up tomorrow at 9 in the morning?" "Of course," Jessica replied, trying to keep her voice professional despite the whirlwind of emotions. As Jessica stood up to leave, Matthew again held her arm. "One last thing. You said you've been working for me for 6 years. How did we meet?" Jessica felt a lump in her throat. The truth was that she had met Matthew in very different circumstances than those listed on her official employee record. But that was a secret she carried alone, something that could destroy not only her career, but any chance of being near him. "Through a normal selection process," she lied softly. "You were looking for a new executive assistant. I applied, and you hired me." But even as the words left her mouth, Jessica knew that Matthew perceived that there was more to the story there. His green eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel as if he could read her thoughts. "Jessica," he said softly, just for her to hear, "I have the feeling that you're much more important in my life than just a secretary, and I have the impression that you're hiding something." Jessica felt her world shake. If he started to really investigate how they met, he would discover a truth that she had buried deeply 6 years ago. A truth that explained not only why she loved him so much, but why she had dedicated her entire life to protecting him, even if it meant never revealing who she really was. "Until tomorrow, Mr. Sterling," she whispered, and left the room before he could ask any more questions. But as she waited for the elevator, Jessica knew that time was running out. Matthew Sterling had always been stubborn when he wanted to find something out. And now, even with his fragmented memory, he was beginning to sense that there were secrets around him that needed to be unraveled. The problem was that some secrets, once revealed, would change everything forever. Friday morning was gray when Jessica arrived at the hospital, carrying a suitcase with clothes she had picked up from Matthew's apartment, a task Mrs. Sterling had reluctantly allowed. As long as a family employee accompanied her, each item chosen was a silent torture. She knew his preferences better than anyone, knew he preferred cotton shirts to synthetics, that he only wore leather watches, that he had a strange superstition with red ties in important meetings. When she got to the room, she found Matthew sitting in the armchair by the window, completely still, his gaze lost in the urban skyline of New York City. There was something disturbing in his posture, a rigidity she had never seen before. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," she said softly, but he didn't respond. Jessica approached slowly, noticing the small contractions in his facial muscles, the way his hands were clenched on the arms of the armchair. There was sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Matthew?" She tried again, this time using only his first name. He blinked slowly, as if waking from a trance. When his eyes focused on her, Jessica saw something that frightened her, pure panic. I was trying to remember something," he said, his voice coming out hoarse. "There was a woman, dark hair. She was crying. And his hands trembled. I can't remember her face, but I know she was important. Very important." Jessica felt her blood run cold. Could it be that he was remembering that night? The night that had changed everything between them 6 years ago. "Maybe it's better not to force it," she suggested carefully. "The doctor said the memories will come back naturally." "No, you don't understand." Matthew stood up abruptly, starting to pace back and forth. "It's as if there's a black hole in my mind, and the more I try to look into it, the more it hurts." He pressed the palms of his hands against his temples. "And it has to do with you?" "With me?" Jessica tried to keep her voice neutral, but she felt her heart race. "Yes, since yesterday when you walked into this room, something in me recognized you, not just as an employee, but as..." He stopped pacing and stared directly at her. "As someone who was very important to me." Jessica opened her mouth to protest, but Matthew raised his hand. "Don't lie to me, Jessica, please." His voice carried a vulnerability she had never heard before. "I may not remember much, but I know when someone is hiding the truth. And you look at me like someone who knows all my secrets." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of the door opening. Mrs. Sterling entered like a hurricane, followed closely by Dr. Miller. "Matthew, darling, how you feel?" "What's going on here?" Mrs. Sterling stopped abruptly upon realizing the tension in the air. "I was trying to remember something," Matthew said, not taking his eyes off Jessica. "Something about her." Dr. Miller approached, clearly concerned. "Mr. Sterling, it's normal to have confusing fragments of memory, but it's important not to stress yourself trying to force them." "They're not confusing fragments," Matthew retorted firmly. "They're emotions, intense feelings connected to this woman, and everyone here is lying to me about it." Mrs. Sterling paled. "Matthew, you're confused. Jessica is just an employee. You've never had any kind of personal relationship." "Then why," Matthew said slowly, approaching Jessica, "do I know that she has a small crescent moon-shaped scar on her left wrist?" Jessica instinctively pulled the sleeve of her blouse down, covering the scar that had resulted from a childhood accident. It was an intimate detail that he could only know if he had seen her bare skin, if he had paid enough attention to memorize her imperfections. "And why," he continued, his voice gaining a dangerous intensity, "do I know that she gets nervous and fidgets with her glasses whenever she lies? How do I know these details about a simple employee?" The silence in the room was deafening. Jessica felt all eyes on her, but she was unable to lie again in the face of the raw determination in Matthew's eyes. Suddenly, Matthew staggered slightly, raising his hand to his head. "The pain, it's coming back." Jessica reacted instinctively, rushing to him and holding him by the arms to steady him. "Breathe slowly," she murmured, her voice taking on a soft, familiar tone that she only used in moments of extreme intimacy. "Close your eyes and breathe with me. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4, exhale for 4. Matthew followed her instructions automatically, and Jessica began to make soft circular motions on his temples, exactly as she had done on that terrible night. 6 years ago, when he had had his first panic attack. "That's it," she whispered. "You're safe." "I'm here." Dr. Miller and Mrs. Sterling watched in complete shock. The familiarity of Jessica's movements, the way Matthew reacted to her touch, the obvious intimacy of that moment. It was impossible to pretend that there was no history there. When Matthew opened his eyes, they were very close. Jessica could feel his breath, see the small wrinkles of worry around his eyes, feel the warmth of his skin. And for a terrible and wonderful moment, it was as if the last 2 years of amnesia didn't exist. "I know this touch," he whispered, his voice laden with something bordering on recognition. "I know your hands." Jessica felt tears burning her eyes. "Matthew, enough!" Mrs. Sterling exploded, physically separating them. "This is completely inappropriate. Jessica, you're taking advantage of my son's vulnerable state." But Matthew ignored his mother completely, his eyes still fixed on Jessica. "That night, the woman crying, that was you, wasn't it?" Jessica closed her eyes, knowing there was no more hiding. "Yes. And what happened between us that night was important enough for me to remember your touch, even with amnesia." "Matthew, please. What aren't you telling me, Jessica?" His voice was almost a whisper, but charged with an intensity that made the air in the room seem electrified. "What secret are you keeping about us?" Dr. Miller approached. "Mr. Sterling, you need to calm down. This level of stress can be detrimental to your recovery." But Matthew wasn't listening to anyone but Jessica. "You're going to tell me," he said, not as a question but as a promise. "Because now I know that there was something between us. Something that everyone is desperate for me not to remember." Mrs. Sterling grabbed Jessica's arm tightly. "You need to get out of here now." But as Jessica turned to leave, Matthew held her hand. The contact sent an electric current through both of them, and Jessica saw in his eyes that he had felt it too. "This conversation isn't over," he said softly, just for her to hear. "And you're not going to run away from me this time?" The promise in his voice was as much a threat as a declaration of war against all who were trying to keep them apart. Matthew's apartment in the Upper East Side was exactly as Jessica remembered. Minimalist, sophisticated, but with small personal touches that revealed the man behind the tycoon. She had insisted on accompanying him home against Mrs. Sterling's express wishes, claiming that she needed to get him organized for the crucial Monday meeting with Japanese investors. Now, 3 hours later, she watched Matthew pace around the living room, clearly restless, trying to reconnect with his own space. He stopped occasionally in front of objects, a bronze sculpture, a silver-framed photo, a stack of books on the coffee table, as if hoping they would awaken some lost memory. "This place," he murmured, running his fingers along the spine of an architecture book, "should be familiar. But it's like being in a stranger's house." Jessica organized documents on the dining table, trying to look busy, but actually watching his every move. She knew she should leave, that every minute there was dangerous, but she couldn't force herself to go. "Jessica!" His voice made her look up. Matthew was standing in front of the panoramic window, looking at the city, but she knew it wasn't the view that held his attention. "That breathing technique you used at the hospital. Where did you learn it?" Jessica hesitated. The truth was that she had learned it during the months of therapy after that terrible night when she needed to cope with panic attacks of her own. "I read about it. I thought it might be useful in stressful situations." Matthew turned slowly to face her. "You're lying again." Before Jessica could respond, the apartment intercom rang. The doorman's voice announced, "Mr. Sterling, Ms. Hamilton is here." "Send her up," Matthew replied automatically, but Jessica noticed the lack of enthusiasm in his voice. Minutes later, Veronica entered the apartment as if she owned it. But this time, she wasn't alone. By her side was a middle-aged man, impeccably dressed, whom Jessica recognized immediately: Arthur Davies, investigative journalist from Vanity Fair, known for his explosive articles about the personal lives of business people. "Matthew, darling," Veronica said, kissing him on the cheek, "I brought Arthur to talk to us about a delicate matter." Jessica felt her blood run cold. Instinctively, she began to gather the documents scattered on the table. "No, please, stay," Arthur said, his predatory smile directed at her. "In fact, Jessica Ramsey, it's exactly with you that I would like to talk." The use of her full name made all the alarms go off in Jessica's mind. "I have nothing to say to the press." "Oh, but I think you do." Arthur opened a folder he was carrying. "Especially about your interesting history with Mr. Sterling." Matthew frowned. "What history?" Arthur smiled like a shark who had smelled blood in the water. "Well, Mr. Sterling, it seems that your executive assistant wasn't always just an employee." He took some photographs out of the folder. These photos were taken 6 years ago, on the night of March 15th, 2019. Jessica felt her world collapse as she saw the images. They were grainy photographs, clearly taken from afar with a telephoto lens, but unmistakable. She and Matthew on the balcony of a hotel in the Hamptons, she crying in his arms, he comforting her with an intimacy that transcended any professional relationship. "Interesting, isn't it?" Arthur continued, clearly savoring the moment. A young college student, 22 years old, studying business administration at NYU, spending a romantic weekend with the CEO of Sterling Tech. Of course, at the time, she wasn't your employee yet. She was just a, how can I say, companion. "That's not true!" Jessica burst out, but her voice sounded too desperate to be convincing. Matthew took the photographs, studying them with an intensity that made Jessica want to disappear. She could see the recognition growing in his eyes, fragments of memory reconnecting. "I remember," he said slowly. "You were crying because your father had just died." The silence in the apartment was deafening. Jessica closed her eyes, knowing there was no more hiding. "You were alone in the world," Matthew continued, his voice gaining certainty, "with no money to continue college, no family, and I..." He stopped, looking at her with an unreadable expression. "I offered to help." "How touching," Veronica said, her voice dripping with venom. "And how convenient that 6 months later, she suddenly appears as the perfect candidate to be your executive assistant." Arthur approached Jessica like a predator. "The question is, Ms. Ramsey, what did Mr. Sterling pay for your college in exchange for exactly? And when did that transaction turn into a job?" It wasn't like that," Jessica whispered, but the words sounded weak even to herself. "No?" Arthur took more documents out of the folder. "Because I have here the payment records from NYU, $24,000 paid in a single transfer 6 months before you were hired. I also have records of an apartment rented in your name, paid for by Sterling Tech, and several monthly transfers to your personal account that suspiciously coincide with meetings." Matthew was growing paler and paler. "Jessica, is this true?" Jessica looked at him, seeing the confusion and something that looked dangerously close to betrayal in his eyes. "Matthew, you need to understand." "Understand what?" Veronica interrupted. "That you took advantage of his kindness? That you turned a vulnerable situation into, what, high-end prostitution?" "Stop it!" Jessica screamed, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't like that. We never." "Then explain," Matthew said, his voice dangerously low. "Explain these photographs. Explain the money. Explain why you hid all this from me." Arthur smiled, knowing he had won. "The question is, Mr. Sterling, what are the Japanese investors going to think when they find out that the CEO of Sterling Tech has a financial relationship with his secretary? And what will the financial press do with this information?" "What do you want?" Matthew asked directly. "It's simple," Veronica answered for Arthur. "Jessica resigns immediately and disappears from your life. In exchange, this story doesn't become a national headline. And if she doesn't accept?" Matthew asked, his eyes still fixed on Jessica. Arthur shrugged. "Well, the magazine hits newsstands on Tuesday. Sterling Tech CEO and the paid secretary scandal would be an interesting headline, don't you think?" Jessica felt her legs weaken. 6 years building a professional reputation. 6 years proving she was more than the circumstances of how she had met Matthew. And it could all be destroyed with a single article. But what devastated her wasn't the threat to her career. It was the expression on Matthew's face, the doubt, the feeling of betrayal, the way he looked at her now as if she were a dangerous stranger. "Matthew," she tried one last time, "let me explain. The truth isn't what they're implying." But Matthew moved away from her, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration that she knew well. "I need time to process this." "Time is exactly what we don't have," Arthur said cheerfully. "I need an answer by Sunday night. Jessica Ramsey resigns and disappears from your lives, or the story goes public." Veronica approached Matthew, placing a possessive hand on his arm. "Darling, you can see now why we were worried. This woman clearly took advantage of you from the beginning." Jessica gathered her things with trembling hands, knowing that anything she said now would only make the situation worse. At the door, she turned one last time. "Matthew," she said softly, "regardless of what you believe about how we started, everything I've felt for you in the last 6 years has been real." But as she left, leaving him with Veronica and Arthur, Jessica knew she had lost not only the man she loved, but any chance of him discovering the truth about who she really was in his life. Sunday arrived like a death sentence. Jessica spent the entire weekend in her apartment, oscillating between despair and a desperate determination to find a way out that didn't exist. She had called Matthew dozens of times, but he didn't answer. Her messages remained unanswered, like screams into the void. At 7 in the evening, her phone finally rang, but it wasn't Matthew. "Jessica." The voice was Mrs. Sterling, colder than a New York winter. "I need you to come to Matthew's apartment, now." "Does he want to see me?" Jessica asked, a thread of hope in her voice. "Just come." The apartment was silent when Jessica arrived. Mrs. Sterling awaited her in the living room, along with Dr. Miller and a man she didn't recognize, someone in an expensive suit with a lawyer's face. "Where's Matthew?" Jessica asked. "In the hospital," Dr. Miller replied gravely. "He had a crisis last night. A seizure related to the traumatic brain injury." Jessica felt the world spin. How is he?" "Stable for now. Mrs. Sterling replied coldly. But the stress of the last few days has clearly aggravated his condition. The doctor was very clear. Any additional pressure can be permanently detrimental. The man in the suit approached. I'm Mr. David Stern, the Sterling family's lawyer. Miss Ramsey, we've come to propose an agreement. Jessica looked between them, feeling a trap closing. What kind of agreement? Mr. Stern opened a folder and took out some documents. In exchange for your immediate resignation and your permanent departure from Matthew Sterling's life, the family is prepared to make a substantial payment, $500,000 plus excellent professional references that will guarantee you find employment anywhere in the United States. You're trying to buy me off, Jessica said, incredulous. We're trying to protect our son, Mrs. Sterling retorted. You saw his condition. Your presence, these revelations about your past, are destroying his recovery. And if I refuse? Mr. Stern smiled coldly. Well, Arthur Davies already has enough material for a series of articles, not just about your financial relationship with Matthew, but also about some other interesting discoveries. Jessica felt her blood run cold. What discoveries? For example, he continued, the fact that you falsified some information on your resume when you applied for the job. Technically, that constitutes fraud. And fraud against a company the size of Sterling Tech is a crime that can result in imprisonment. I never falsified anything. No? Mr. Stern took out more papers. Here it says that you graduated from NYU in December 2019. But the records show that you actually dropped out of the program in March of that year, shortly after your father's death. You only went back to school when Matthew paid your tuition, and you graduated 2 years later. Therefore, when you applied for the job claiming to be a graduate, you lied. Jessica closed her eyes. It was a cruel distortion of the truth, but technically correct. She had stopped college after her father's death, only returning when Matthew helped her. When she applied for the job, she was only a few months away from graduating. Furthermore, Mr. Stern continued relentlessly, we have evidence that you used privileged information obtained through your relationship with Matthew to make personal investments. That constitutes insider trading. That's a lie. Is it really? Mrs. Sterling approached. Then how do you explain the purchase of Technovale stock 3 days before the announcement of the merger with Sterling Tech? A transaction that earned you $50,000 in profit? Jessica remembered the transaction. Matthew had mentioned casually during a work conversation that he was interested in Technovale. She had invested her small savings, never imagining that it could be seen as a crime. I can explain to the FBI, Mr. Stern interrupted, because that's exactly where this information is going if you don't accept our agreement. Insider trading is a federal crime, Ms. Ramsey. You can get from 1 to 5 years in prison. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica sat heavily on the sofa, realizing that she was completely cornered. They had planned everything meticulously, turning every gesture of kindness from Matthew into evidence against her. And if I sign? She asked softly. You disappear, Mrs. Sterling said simply. No contact with Matthew, no trying to see him, no interfering in his recovery. In exchange, all these misunderstandings are forgotten. Jessica looked at the documents on the table. $500,000 was more money than she could earn in years. She could start a new life, far from New York, far from the memories. But it also meant abandoning Matthew at the moment when he most needed someone who really knew him. Did he ask you to do this? She asked, her voice breaking. Dr. Miller answered gently, Miss Jessica, Matthew is very confused right now. The revelations about you, combined with his medical condition, he's not in a condition to make rational decisions, but does he remember me? Us? Fragments, Dr. Miller admitted. But those memories are causing more trauma than healing. Perhaps it's better for him to forget completely. Jessica closed her eyes, feeling warm tears streaming down her face. 6 years of love, dedication, hope, all coming down to this. An exit through the back door with a silent payment and a perpetual banishment. But as she picked up the pen, her phone vibrated. A message Her heart stopped when she saw it was from Matthew. "Jessica, I need to talk to you. I'm remembering more things. Please don't give up on me." Mrs. Sterling saw the message and snatched the phone from her hands. "He's delirious from the medication. This just proves that you need to get out of his life." "Let me see him," Jessica begged. "One last time. Let me explain." "Impossible," Dr. Miller said. "Any additional stress can cause permanent brain damage. Do you want to be responsible for that?" Jessica looked at the faces around her, all determined, all convinced that they were protecting Matthew from her. And maybe they were right. Maybe she really was toxic for him. Maybe the love she felt was too selfish for his own good. With trembling hands, she signed the documents. "You have 48 hours to leave New York City," Mr. Stern said, collecting the papers. "And remember, any attempt to contact him will result in the public exposure of all these legal issues." Jessica stood up, feeling like a zombie. At the door, Mrs. Sterling held her arm. "Jessica," she said, and for the first time her voice had an almost gentle tone, "you're a good girl. But sometimes loving someone means letting them go." As Jessica left the apartment for the last time, she knew she was leaving behind not only the man she loved, but the entire life she had built. In the next 48 hours, she would have to disappear completely, as if Jessica Ramsey had never existed in the life of Matthew Sterling. What she didn't know was that, at that exact moment, Matthew was fighting against the sedatives in the hospital, remembering more and more clearly that night 6 years ago. Remembering not only how she had helped him, but how she had saved his life too. And when he finally woke up and discovered that she had disappeared, the real hell would just begin. Delay. 3 days after leaving New York City, Jessica was in a modest hotel in Miami, trying to reconstruct the fragments of her life. The money from the Sterling family had been deposited into her account, but every penny felt dirty, stained by the humiliation of having been bought off as a problem to be solved. She had found a small apartment to rent near the beach, thinking that maybe the sound of the waves would help her forget the words that Matthew had said about finding peace near the sea. She was organizing her few belongings when her phone rang. "Unknown number, Jessica Ramsey." The voice was female, young, nervous. "Yes, my name is Carol Olson. I worked at Sterling Tech until last week. I need to talk to you. It's about what they did to you and Mr. Matthew." Jessica felt her heart race. "Who are you?" "I was Mrs. Sterling's assistant. Or rather, I was her spy inside the company. But I quit when I found out what they did." The girl's voice trembled. "Can I meet you?" "I have proof that everything was rigged." 2 hours later, Jessica was sitting in a cafe on the beach, watching a young woman with curly hair approach nervously. Carol couldn't be more than 25 years old, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," Carol said, sitting down and constantly looking over her shoulder. "I couldn't bear to keep this to myself anymore. What do you want to tell me?" Carol opened a backpack and took out a folder. "First, you need to know that I was hired a year ago specifically to watch you. Mrs. Sterling suspected that you had feelings for Mr. Matthew, and she wanted evidence to fire you." Jessica felt a pang of pain, but no surprise. "Continue. But the more I watched you, the more I realized that you really cared about him. It wasn't interest, it wasn't opportunism. It was real love." Carol opened the folder. "When the accident happened, Mrs. Sterling saw an opportunity. She contacted Arthur Davies even before Mr. Matthew left the hospital. She planned everything. Worse than that. She paid Arthur to investigate your past and create some evidence." Jessica froze. "Create?" Carol took some photographs out of the folder. "Remember that photo of you with Mr. Matthew in the Hamptons? The one that supposedly showed you on a romantic date?" "Yes." "Look at the date in the corner." Carol pointed to a small digital number. "March 15th, 2019. But this photo was taken in October 2019, 7 months after your father's death." Jessica studied the image more closely and felt the world spin. "But I remember that day in the Hamptons." "Exactly. Because it really happened. But it wasn't a romantic date." Carol took out more documents. I managed to access the hotel records. Mr. Matthew was there for a technology conference. You were there because you had just gotten a temporary job as a translator for the event. The memories came back like an avalanche. Jessica remembered now. She had gotten a temporary job translating for foreign business people at the event. That's where she met Matthew for the first time, when he needed an emergency translator for a meeting with Japanese investors. And why was I crying on the balcony? Because it was the anniversary of your father's death. You had gone out to cry away from everyone, and Mr. Matthew found you. He comforted you as any decent person would. Carol showed another document. But Arthur photographed you, manipulated the date, and created a completely false narrative. Jessica felt anger boiling in her veins. And the payments? The accusation that he paid for my college? Half-truth. He really paid, but not as you think. Carol took out a last document, a copy of a contract. Remember that translation job? Mr. Matthew was so impressed with your professionalism that he offered you a freelance contract to translate company documents. The payment for college was your salary for 6 months of work. Jessica looked at the contract, signed by herself. The memories returned. The nights translating complex contracts, the weekends working on proposals for international clients. She had truly worked for every penny. But why did I accept the job as gun secretary afterwards? Because you were good, better than anyone they had interviewed. Mr. Matthew didn't know about your financial situation when he offered you the job. To him, you were simply the most competent translator he had ever met. Jessica leaned back in her chair, feeling nauseous. The whole story had been distorted, manipulated to make her look like an opportunist. Why are you telling me this? Because Mr. Matthew is getting worse. Carol lowered her voice. He remembered everything. About how you really met, about how you helped him during that terrible period after his parents' divorce, about how you were the only person he really trusted. Jessica's heart soared. He remembered? Completely. And when he asked to see you, Mrs. Sterling and Veronica told him that you had run off with the money, proving that you were always only after his money. Carol took Jessica's hand. He doesn't know that you were blackmailed. He thinks that you really abandoned him for money. How is he? Destroyed. He stopped eating, barely speaks to anyone. The doctors are worried about severe depression. Carol hesitated. But there's more. Veronica and Mrs. Sterling are pressuring him to sign new documents while he's still emotionally unstable. Something about transferring stock control. Jessica stood up abruptly. They're trying to steal his company. Not directly, but they're making him sign documents that would give Veronica decision-making power if he's declared incapable of managing the company due to emotional instability. Jessica's anger turned into something cold and calculating. She had been used against Matthew as a weapon, used to destroy his trust and emotional stability. And now that she was out of the way, they could complete their plan. Carol, do you still have access to the office? Technically, yes. My badge still works until Friday. And would you be willing to help me save the company you just left? Carol smiled for the first time since they had met. Ms. Jessica, I was hoping you'd ask that. Jessica picked up her phone and started taking notes. If Matthew thought she had betrayed him, then she needed to prove her innocence. But more importantly than that, she needed to protect him from the people who really wanted to destroy him. Carol, I need you to get me 3 things. Access to the documents that Matthew has signed in the last few days, a copy of Veronica's financial records, and Dr. Miller's number. What are you planning? Jessica smiled, and for the first time in days, she felt hope. I'm going to do what I should have done from the beginning. I'm going to fight for the man I love. That night, while planning her return to New York City, Jessica received a final call from Carol. Jessica, I need to warn you about something. Mrs. Sterling has scheduled an emergency board meeting for tomorrow at 5 in the afternoon. She's going to try to get Matthew to sign the final documents. How much time do I have? 16 hours. Jessica closed her eyes, knowing that this was her last chance. If she failed, she would lose Matthew forever, not just to amnesia or to Veronica, but to a trap that would leave him without memory. without a company, and without any possibility of discovering the truth. The war was just beginning. The 22nd floor of Sterling Tech had never seemed so intimidating to Jessica. It was 4:45 in the afternoon, and she knew she had only 15 minutes before the board meeting started. Carol was waiting for her in the parking garage with all the evidence they had collected in the last 16 frantic hours. Forged documents, payment records for Arthur, emails between Mrs. Sterling and Veronica discussing how to remove obstacles from Matthew's life. Jessica adjusted the dark blazer she had bought hastily in Miami and took a deep breath. She was no longer the insecure secretary who had been blackmailed and humiliated. She was a woman fighting for the man she loved and for the truth that deserved to be told. The elevator doors opened directly into the board meeting room. Jessica could hear voices through the frosted glass door, Mrs. Sterling commanding the meeting, Veronica talking about emotional stability, and Matthew's voice, low and resigned, agreeing with everything they said. She pushed open the double doors and entered. The silence was instant and absolute. 8 members of the board turned to face her. Mrs. Sterling paled as if she had seen a ghost, and Veronica let out a small gasp of shock. But it was Matthew who captured all her attention. He was sitting at the head of the table, still showing the effects of hospitalization, thinner, with deep circles under his eyes, but his green eyes were completely focused and lucid. When he saw her, a succession of emotions passed over his face: surprise, pain, anger, and something she couldn't identify. "Jessica?" His voice came out hoarse. "What are you doing here?" "Preventing you from making the biggest mistake of your life," she replied, walking to the table with a confidence she didn't know she possessed. Mrs. Sterling recovered quickly. "You have no authority to be here. You're no longer an employee of this company." "You're right," Jessica placed her folder on the table. "But I have something that I believe everyone should see before they sign any documents." Mr. Stern, the family lawyer, stood up. "Ms. Ramsey, you are violating the terms of the agreement you signed. That can result in..." "In what?" Jessica interrupted him. "More blackmail, more lies." She opened the folder and spread the photographs on the table. "Because that's exactly what we're talking about here." Matthew approached to see the images. "These are the photos that Arthur showed me." "Yes, but look at the dates." Jessica pointed to the digital numbers. "This photo was supposedly taken in March 2019, on the night of my father's death. But see here, the real date is October 2019. A murmur ran through the room. Matthew picked up the photograph, studying it intensely. "That doesn't prove anything," Mrs. Sterling said quickly. "Cameras can have the wrong dates." "They can," Jessica agreed, taking out more documents. "But hotel records don't lie. Here's the reservation for the Plaza Hotel in the Hamptons, October 2019. Matthew Sterling, room 247, reservation for a business conference. And here," she showed another paper, "is my contract as a freelance translator for the event." The silence in the room was deafening. Matthew read the documents with growing understanding, his memories finally aligning with the truth. "You were crying," he said slowly, "because it was the anniversary of your father's death, not because we were. Because we never had a romantic relationship at that time," Jessica confirmed. "You comforted me as any decent person would. But Arthur photographed that moment, manipulated the date, and created a false narrative." Veronica stood up abruptly. "Those are just technical misunderstandings. The fact remains that there were suspicious financial transfers." "You mean my salary?" Jessica retrieved the freelance work contract. "For 6 months of translating complex documents, working nights and weekends? Here are all the files I translated, all the hours worked." Matthew took the contract, his expression changing gradually. "I remember now. You translated the agreement with the Yamamoto Corporation. It was 40 pages of technical terms that no one else could decipher. And the apartment that was paid for by the company." Mrs. Sterling tried one last gambit. "It was payment for the translation services," Jessica replied calmly. Matthew offered to pay my living expenses for 6 months instead of a lump sum to help me stabilize financially while I finished college. One of the board members, Dr. Charles Peterson, leaned forward. Ms. Ramsey, this evidence is compelling, but it still doesn't explain why you disappeared after signing an agreement with the family. Jessica took a deep breath. It was the moment of complete truth. Because I was blackmailed. Mrs. Sterling and Mr. Stern threatened me with fabricated criminal charges if I didn't disappear from Matthew's life. That's a very serious accusation, Dr. Peterson said. And I have proof. Jessica retrieved her phone and activated an audio file. This is a recording of our last conversation. Mrs. Sterling's voice echoed through the room. Insider trading is a federal crime, Ms. Ramsey. You can get from 1 to 5 years in prison. You disappear. No contact with Matthew, no trying to see him, no interfering in his recovery. The shock in the room was palpable. Several members of the board looked at Mrs. Sterling with expressions of horror and disbelief. Matthew stood up slowly, his chair scraping in the silence. "Mom," his voice was dangerously low, "you blackmailed Jessica to get her out of my life? I was protecting you." Mrs. Sterling exploded. "That woman was taking advantage of your condition." "Taking advantage?" Matthew began to laugh, but it was a humorless sound. "Jessica knew my routine, my preferences, my fears better than anyone in this room. She took care of my company, my schedule, my life for 6 years without asking for anything in return." He turned to Veronica. "And you? What was your role in this charade?" Veronica tried to approach him. "Matthew, darling, you need to understand that we did this because we love you." "Love?" Matthew recoiled from her as if he had been burned. "You destroyed the life of the only person who truly cared about me, manipulated my fragmented memory, and tried to make me sign documents that would take away my control of my own company. Is that love?" Dr. Peterson stood up. "Mr. Sterling, perhaps we should postpone this meeting until—" "No," Matthew said firmly. "I want to resolve this now." He turned to Jessica, and she saw tears in his eyes. "Jessica, I remember everything now. Not just how we met, but everything." Jessica felt her heart stop. "Everything." "I remember how you stayed late, helping me with impossible presentations. How you always knew when I was stressed and showed up with coffee and those cookies your neighbor made. How you never lost patience with me even when I was impossible." His voice broke. "And I remember falling in love with you, little by little, over 6 years, without having the courage to admit it." The silence in the room was so profound that Jessica could hear her own heart beating. "You fell in love with me?" she whispered. Matthew took a step towards her. "Completely, irremediably. And when I woke up in the hospital without being able to remember you, it was as if they had ripped part of my soul out." Jessica felt tears streaming down her face. "Matthew, but now I remember everything. I remember planning to tell you how I felt on the night of the accident. I remember buying a ring." He stopped, looking directly into her eyes. "Jessica Ramsey, I should have done this years ago, but I'm doing it now in front of all these people as witnesses." To the absolute shock of everyone in the room, Matthew knelt down. "Will you marry me? Not as my secretary, not as my employee, but as my partner, my best friend, the woman I love more than my own life." Jessica looked at the man kneeling before her, the billionaire CEO, the tech mogul, the most powerful man she knew, and saw only Matthew, the man who had consoled a crying stranger 6 years ago, who had offered work instead of charity, who had fallen in love with her in the same gradual and inexorable way that she had fallen in love with him. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes." When Matthew stood up and kissed her, Jessica felt as if the last few nightmarish days had finally come to an end. Love had conquered manipulation, truth had triumphed over lies, and finally, after 6 years of silent love, they were where they always should have been, in each other's arms. 6 months later, Jessica Sterling, she still smiled every time she heard her new name, was standing on the balcony of the new apartment they shared, watching the New York City skyline light up with the sunset. Sterling Tech was stronger than ever. Mrs. Sterling had retired completely from the family business after the scandal, and Veronica had disappeared overseas with a generous settlement in exchange for her silence. "Thinking about what?" Matthew asked, wrapping her from behind with his arms. "About how sometimes love needs to fight against the whole world to win," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "And about how every second of that fight is worth it," he murmured in her ear, kissing her temple where there was still a small scar from his own accident. Jessica smiled, knowing that some love stories don't start with love at first sight, but with years of dedication, mutual respect, and the courage to fight for the truth when everything seems lost. And the best stories, she had learned, are those in which love not only wins, but becomes stronger through every obstacle overcome.